They told her she was worthless. They told her she was nothing more than a placeholder, a trophy wife past her prime, who didn't deserve a single penny of the Sterling family empire. When Richard Sterling threw his wife out into the pouring rain, he thought he had won. He thought his iron-clad prenuptial agreement would leave her destitute while he ran off with his younger mistress. But Richard forgot one tiny, crucial detail. He never actually checked who his wife really was. He didn't know that the woman he was discarding held a name so powerful that merely whispering it in a courtroom would make the judge stand up in fear. This is the story of the most brutal divorce in high society history, and the shocking twist that no one saw coming. The mahogany doors of the Sterling estate didn't just close. They slammed with a finality that echoed in Charlotte's chest. It was raining. Of course it was raining. It felt like a cliché from a bad movie. But as the icy water soaked through her thin cashmere sweater, the shivering reality set in. At her feet lay 3 Louis Vuitton suitcases, hastily packed, scratched from being shoved down the front steps by Richard's security guard. "Please, Richard, be reasonable." Charlotte's voice cracked, barely audible over the thunder. The front door opened again, but only halfway. Richard Sterling, CEO of Sterling Dynamics, and the man she had devoted the last 7 years of her life to, stood there. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was holding a glass of scotch, swirling it gently, a smirk playing on his lips. Beside him, clinging to his arm like a decorative vine, was Jessica. She was 24, his executive assistant, and currently wearing the diamond necklace Charlotte had received for her 5th anniversary. "I'm being reasonable, Charlotte," Richard called out, his voice smooth and indifferent. "Reasonable men don't stay married to women who have nothing to offer. You've aged out of the role, darling. Jessica here. She's the future. Your history. I supported you when the board tried to oust you." Charlotte screamed, the rain plastering her hair to her face. "I nursed your mother when she had her stroke. I signed everything you asked me to sign." "Exactly." Richard laughed, taking a sip of the amber liquid. "You signed everything, including the prenuptial agreement that explicitly states that in the event of a divorce initiated by infidelity on either side or irreconcilable differences, you leave with exactly what you brought into the marriage, which, if I recall correctly, was a pile of student debt and a used Honda Civic." He stepped forward just to the edge of the dry porch, looking down at her like she was a stray dog. "My lawyers, Cromwell and Finch, have already filed the papers. You have 0 claim to the Sterling fortune, 0 claim to the house, 0 claim to my future earnings. You are walking away with nothing, Charlotte, just like you were when I found you waiting tables in that diner." "Richard, don't do this," she pleaded, not for the money, but for the sheer cruelty of it. "Where am I supposed to go?" "I really don't care." He shrugged. "But I'd suggest getting off my driveway before I call the police for trespassing. You're no longer a resident here." Jessica giggled, whispering something in Richard's ear. He smirked and kissed her forehead. "Goodbye, Charlotte. Do try not to make a scene in court. It will be embarrassing for you." The heavy door slammed shut again. The click of the deadbolt was the loudest sound in the world. Charlotte stood there for a long time, the rain mixing with the hot tears streaming down her face. She looked at the closed door, the symbol of the life she thought was real. She had loved him. She really had. She had hidden her past, her identity, and her potential, just to be the supportive, submissive wife he wanted. She had dimmed her own light so he could shine, and this was her reward. Slowly, the trembling in her hands stopped. The sorrow in her eyes hardened into something colder, something like steel. She reached into her wet pocket and pulled out a burner phone she had kept hidden in the lining of her suitcase. She dialed a number she hadn't called in 7 years. It rang once, twice. "Hello," a gruff, elderly voice answered. "This is a private line. Who is this? I'm Uncle Arthur," Charlotte said, her voice no longer shaking. "It's me, it's Lottie." There was a profound silence on the other end, then a sharp intake of breath. "Charlotte. My God, is it really you? We thought, after you ran away, we thought you were gone for good." "I need a favor, Arthur," she said, looking up at the bedroom window where the lights had just turned off. "I need you to reactivate the trust, and I need the best litigator at Holloway, Pierce & Associates ready by Monday morning." "The trust," Arthur stammered. "Charlotte, if you reactivate the trust, the confidentiality clause breaks. The world will know. He will know." "That's the point," Charlotte whispered, wiping the rain from her eyes. "He wanted a divorce. I'm going to give him a war." 3 weeks later, Richard Sterling was sitting in the high-rise conference room of Sterling Dynamics, feeling like the king of the world. "The merger is all but guaranteed, Richard," his CFO, a nervous man named Greg, said, while pointing at the charts. "With the acquisition of the North Tech supply chain, our stock is going to triple. You'll be a billionaire by the end of the quarter." Richard leaned back in his leather chair, propping his feet up on the mahogany table. "And the divorce? Clean cut?" Greg nodded. "We've got Judge Harrison presiding. Well, let's just say he owes your father a few favors from back in the day. Plus, he's old school. He hates gold diggers. He'll look at Charlotte, see a waitress who got lucky for 7 years, and grant the prenup execution immediately. She won't get a dime." "Good," Richard grinned. "She's been quiet. Too quiet. I expected her to run to the tabloids crying about how I mistreated her, but not a peep." "Maybe she realized she's beaten," Jessica cooed from the corner where she was pretending to organize files, but was mostly shopping for wedding dresses online. "She's probably back in some trailer park by now." Richard checked his watch. "The preliminary hearing is tomorrow at 9:00 a.m. I want to wear the Navy Armani. Let's make this quick. I want her name off my accounts and her presence out of my life so we can announce the engagement." Meanwhile, across the city, the atmosphere was very different. Charlotte sat in a dimly lit office that smelled of old books and expensive cigars. The sign on the door didn't say lawyer. It simply said, Holloway, Pierce & Associates, Private Client Services. This wasn't a firm you found on Google. This was the firm that cleaned up messes for royalty and drafted treaties for small nations. Arthur Holloway, a man of 80 with sharp eyes and a sharper suit, slid a folder across the desk. "Everything is in order, Lottie," he said softly. "But are you sure about this? Once we walk into that courtroom, there is no going back. The media will swarm. Your privacy, the life you tried to build away from the shadow of your family. It's over." Charlotte ran her hand over the leather file. "He threw me out in the rain, Arthur. He humiliated me. He thinks I'm a helpless waitress he rescued." "He doesn't know?" Arthur asked, raising an eyebrow. "He never asked." Charlotte said, a bitter smile touching her lips. "In 7 years, he never asked about my parents, really. He just accepted the story that they were dead. He never asked about my education. He just assumed I was uneducated because I was working at a diner when we met. He saw what he wanted to see, a pretty face with no background. And he's about to find out that pretty face owns the bank that holds his mortgage." Arthur chuckled dryly. "Not just the mortgage, Arthur," Charlotte corrected him, her eyes flashing. I looked into the Sterling Dynamics financials last night. The merger he's planning, the one with North Tech. Yes, North Tech is a subsidiary of Kensington Global. Arthur's eyes widened. Your father's holding company. My holding company, she corrected him. Since Dad passed, I am the majority shareholder. I just let the board run it while I played house with Richard. But if Richard thinks he's buying North Tech to save his company, he's asking his soon-to-be ex-wife for permission to buy her own company. Arthur finished, a look of pure delight spreading across his face. Exactly. Charlotte stood up, smoothing down the skirt of the simple, inexpensive grey suit she had bought at a thrift store. She needed to look the part of the struggling victim one last time. Tomorrow, I'm not going in as Charlotte Kensington. I'm going in as Charlotte Sterling, the discarded wife. I want him to say it on the record. I want him to tell the judge I'm worth nothing. And then? Arthur asked. And then? Charlotte said, we burn him to the ground. The next morning, the courthouse was buzzing. Richard had tipped off the press, wanting to spin the narrative early. Flashbulbs popped as he stepped out of his black limousine, Jessica on his arm, looking every bit the power couple. He waved confidently, projecting the image of a man unbothered by a nuisance lawsuit. Charlotte arrived 10 minutes later in a taxi. She walked up the steps alone, clutching a battered purse. The reporters barely noticed her. She looked tired, pale, and defeated. Inside the courtroom, the air was stale. Judge Harrison sat high on the bench, looking bored. He was a man known for quick rulings and a dislike for emotional outbursts. Sterling versus Sterling, the bailiff announced. Richard sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by 3 high-priced lawyers from Cromwell and Finch. They had stacks of binders' charts and the prenuptial agreement blown up on a poster board. Charlotte sat at the defendant's table alone. The seat beside her was empty. Mrs. Sterling. Judge Harrison peered over his glasses. You are unrepresented. Charlotte stood up. Her voice small. My attorney is running a few minutes late, Your Honor. Traffic. Richard snorted loudly enough for the back row to hear. She probably couldn't afford a lawyer. Your Honor, if she needs a public defender, we can wait. I don't need a public defender, Charlotte said, her voice strengthening slightly. We are on a tight schedule, Judge Harrison snapped. If your counsel isn't here in 2 minutes, we proceed without them. Mr. Cromwell, please state your opening. Richard's lead lawyer, a shark named Marcus Cromwell. No relation to the band name, just a coincidence of the trade, stood up, buttoning his jacket. Your Honor, this is a simple case. We have a prenuptial agreement signed 7 years ago. It states clearly that in the event of separation, assets remain separate. Mr. Sterling's assets are valued at $40 million. Mrs. Sterling's assets are negligible. We ask for immediate dissolution of the marriage and enforcement of the prenup. It seems straightforward. The judge nodded, looking at Charlotte with disdain. Mrs. Sterling, do you contest the validity of the prenup? I do, Your Honor, Charlotte said. On what grounds? Richard interjected, laughing. Did you not read it? It was written in English, not quantum physics. On the grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation of assets. A deep voice boomed from the back of the courtroom. The heavy double doors swung open. The room went silent. Walking down the center aisle wasn't just a lawyer. It was Arthur Holloway. And he wasn't alone. Behind him walked 3 other attorneys, all wearing the distinctive grey ties of Holloway, Pierce and Associates. The silence in the room changed frequency. It went from bored to confused, and then for the older lawyers in the room, to terrified. Holloway, Pierce and Associates didn't do divorce court. They didn't do traffic tickets. They handled mergers for nations. They represented the Crown. Richard frowned, leaning over to his lawyer. "Who is that old guy?" Cromwell's face had gone paper white. That's Arthur Holloway, the Iron Lion of the Bar Association. He hasn't been in a courtroom in 10 years. Arthur stopped at the defense table and placed a gentle hand on Charlotte's shoulder. He looked up at the judge. "Your Honor," Arthur said, his voice filling the room without a microphone. "I apologize for the delay. I was busy filing a countersuit in the Federal District Court." "A countersuit?" Judge Harrison stammered. He knew Arthur Holloway. Everyone knew Arthur Holloway. "Mr. Holloway, this is a simple family law matter. What could possibly require federal intervention?" "It is not a simple family law matter, Your Honor." Arthur smiled a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Because the plaintiff, Mr. Sterling, is attempting to enforce a financial agreement against my client, while simultaneously attempting to acquire a company that my client owns." Richard stood up, his face red. "That's a lie. She owns nothing. She was a waitress." Arthur turned slowly to face Richard. The look of contempt on his face was withering. "Mr. Sterling," Arthur said calmly, "you are under the impression you married Charlotte Holloway, the waitress, and you did. But you never asked why she was working there. You never asked about her mother's maiden name." Arthur turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, may I introduce my client properly? This is not just Charlotte Sterling. This is Charlotte Kensington, only daughter of the late Duke of Kensington, and the sole heir to the Kensington Global Banking estate." The sound of a pin dropping would have sounded like a gunshot. Richard froze. The blood drained from his face so fast, he looked like he might faint. Kensington. The Kensingtons owned the building Sterling Dynamics rented. They owned the insurance company that insured his car. They were old money that made his $40 million look like pocket change. "That's impossible," Richard whispered. Charlotte finally turned to look at him. The shy, beaten-down wife was gone. In her place sat a woman with the posture of a queen and the eyes of an executioner. "Sit down, Richard," Charlotte said, her voice cool and commanding. "We're just getting started." The silence in courtroom 4B was heavy, the kind of silence that precedes a natural disaster. Richard Sterling stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, looking from the stoic face of Arthur Holloway to the icy, composed visage of the woman he had married 7 years ago. "Kensington." Richard finally choked out the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. That's absurd. Charlotte's father was a mechanic from Ohio. She told me that herself." Charlotte remained seated, her hands folded neatly on the table. She didn't speak. She let Arthur do the talking. The older lawyer adjusted his glasses, pulling a sheet of paper from the thick file. "My client told you her father fixed things and liked to work with his hands," Arthur corrected smoothly. "The late Duke of Kensington was indeed an avid restorer of vintage automobiles. He spent most of his time in his garage. You, Mr. Sterling, assumed mechanic because it fit the narrative you constructed for my client, simple, poor, and beneath you." Judge Harrison cleared his throat. The arrogance had vanished from his demeanor, replaced by a sheen of nervous sweat. He was up for re-election next year, and the Kensington family was a major donor to the Judicial Oversight Committee. He couldn't be seen bullying the Kensington heiress. "Mr. Holloway," the judge said, his voice trembling slightly, "while this revelation regarding Mrs. Sterling's lineage is surprising, does it materially affect the case The plaintiff is requesting the enforcement of the prenuptial agreement. Oh, we are more than happy to enforce the prenuptial agreement, Your Honor, Arthur said, a predatory smile crossing his face. Richard's lawyer, Marcus Cromwell, looked up sharply. He was a smart man, and he knew that when a lawyer like Arthur Holloway agreed to something, it was a trap. "Wait a minute," Cromwell muttered. "You see," Arthur continued, pacing in front of the bench. "Mr. Sterling was very specific when he drafted this agreement. He included a total separation of assets clause, Clause 4, Section B. Neither party shall have any claim to the assets, inheritance, or business ventures acquired by the other party prior to or during the marriage." "Exactly," Richard shouted, regaining some of his bluster. "That means she can't touch my company. She can't touch my 40 million. And it means you, Mr. Sterling." Charlotte spoke up for the first time, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Cannot touch mine." Richard scoffed. "I don't want your money. I have my own." "Do you?" Charlotte asked. She stood up, slowly picking up a document from Arthur's stack. "Because according to this foreclosure notice, Sterling Dynamics is currently leveraged to the hilt. You borrowed $15 million 5 years ago to expand into the Asian market. A loan from sovereign private equity." Richard paled. "That's confidential business information." "How did you—" "I am sovereign private equity," Charlotte said calmly. The color drained from Richard's face entirely. Jessica, sitting in the gallery, gasped audibly. "When you couldn't get a loan from the major banks because your credit was overextended," Charlotte explained, walking slowly toward the plaintiff's table, "you came home complaining about how the system was rigged. You didn't know that I called my trustees that night and authorized the loan through a shell company. I funded your expansion, Richard. I saved your career." You loaned me the money," Richard whispered. "And you missed your last 3 interest payments because you were too busy buying diamond necklaces for your assistant," Charlotte said, glancing at Jessica. "Under the terms of the loan agreement, which you signed without reading, just like you assumed I signed the prenup without reading, the lender has the right to call the full principal immediately in the event of a default." Arthur stepped forward, slamming a heavy document onto the judge's bench. "Your Honor, sovereign private equity is hereby calling the loan. Mr. Sterling owes the trust $15 million plus penalties and interest, totaling $18 million. Since he does not have the liquid cash, we are filing a motion to freeze all assets of Sterling Dynamics and Mr. Sterling personally until the debt is satisfied." "Objection!" Cromwell screamed, standing up. "This is an ambush. This is a divorce hearing, not a bankruptcy court." "It is a divorce hearing," Judge Harrison said, looking at the papers with wide eyes. "But financial standing is relevant. Mr. Cromwell, if your client is $18 million in debt to his wife's trust, effectively, he is bankrupt." "I have the merger," Richard shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "The North Tech merger closes on Friday. That deal is worth $50 million. I can pay her back then." Charlotte looked at him with an expression that was almost pitying. "Richard, you really don't listen, do you?" She leaned in close, her voice a whisper that the microphones picked up clearly. "I told you, I am North Tech. My father bought North Tech in the 90s. It's part of the Kensington portfolio." Richard stared at her, his eyes bulging. "No. There is no merger," Charlotte said coldly. "I pulled the deal this morning at 8:00 a.m. Sterling Dynamics is acquiring nothing. Your stock is going to plummet the moment the market opens." Richard slumped back into his chair, looking like a man who had been punched in the gut. The empire he thought he built, the wealth, he thought made him superior was all a mirage. It was all her. It had always been her. "Judge," Arthur said, buttoning his suit jacket, "since the plaintiff is financially insolvent and has attempted to defraud my client by hiding his debt status, we move to dismiss his petition for divorce on his terms. We are countersuing for full dissolution based on adultery and financial misconduct. And we are requesting immediate possession of the marital home as it was used as collateral for the defaulted loan." Judge Harrison didn't hesitate. He banged his gavel. "Motion granted. Assets frozen. The marital home is returned to Mrs. Sterling, effective immediately. Mr. Sterling, you have 24 hours to vacate the premises." Richard looked up, his eyes wild. "You can't do this. I'm Richard Sterling." "Not anymore," Charlotte said, turning her back on him. "No, you're just a trespassing tenant." The rain had stopped when Richard stumbled out of the courthouse, but the storm in his life was just beginning. Reporters swarmed him. Usually Richard loved the press. He loved the attention. But today the questions were like daggers. "Mr. Sterling, is it true you're bankrupt? Is it true your wife owns your company? Are you being evicted?" He pushed through them, shoving a cameraman aside. Jessica was trotting behind him, struggling to keep up in her heels. She looked terrified. The confident, smug mistress from the morning was gone. "Richard, wait," she cried, grabbing his arm as they reached the limo. "What does this mean? What about the condo you promised to buy me? What about the Paris trip?" Richard spun around, his face purple with rage. "Shut up. Just shut up, Jessica. Can't you see what's happening? She played me. She played me for 7 years. He threw himself into the back of the car. Jessica hesitated, then climbed in. The driver, a man named Frank, who had been with Richard for years, looked in the rearview mirror. "Where to, Mr. Sterling?" "The office," Richard snarled. "Drive fast. I need to get to the board before she does." He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed Greg, his CFO. It went straight to voicemail. He dialed the chairman of the board, a stern man named Jonathan Hayes. Voicemail. "Damn it!" Richard threw the phone against the leather seat. "Richard," Jessica whispered, shrinking into the corner. Maybe we should just apologize if she has that much money. Maybe she'll give you a settlement just to make you go away." Richard laughed, a harsh, manic sound. "Apologize to Charlotte." "She was a waitress, Jessica. I saved her from a life of serving coffee. She should be grateful I married her at all. This is a misunderstanding. Once I explain to the board that this is just a bitter ex-wife trying to sabotage the company, they'll back me. I'm the founder. They can't run Sterling Dynamics without me." The car screeched to a halt in front of the gleaming glass tower of the Sterling building. Richard didn't wait for Frank to open the door. He burst out storming through the lobby. The receptionist, a young woman who usually greeted him with a bright smile, looked down at her desk, refusing to make eye contact. The security guard, usually quick to salute, pretended to be busy with his radio. Richard ignored them, jamming his finger against the elevator button. Come on. When the doors opened on the top floor, the executive suite, the atmosphere was wrong. Usually it was bustling with energy. Today it was silent. People were packing boxes. Richard ran down the hallway to the boardroom. The double glass doors were closed. He could see silhouettes inside. "They're having a meeting without me," he hissed. He threw the doors open. "What the hell is going on here?" The room fell silent. Around the long oval table sat the 12 members of the board of directors. At the head of the table, his seat sat a man he didn't recognize. He was young, sharp-featured, wearing a suit that cost more than Richard's car. "You're late, Mr. Sterling," the man said calmly. "Who are you?" Richard demanded, marching forward. "Get out of my chair. Jonathan, why is this stranger in my seat?" Jonathan Hayes, the board chairman, didn't look at Richard. He looked at the paperwork in front of him. "Richard, please, sit down." "I will not sit down," Richard roared. "I am the CEO of this company. I want an explanation." "The explanation," the young man at the head of the table said, "is that you no longer hold a controlling interest in this firm." "Liar," Richard spat. "I own 51% of the voting stock." "You did," the man corrected. "But you pledged 20% of that stock as collateral for a personal line of credit with Vanguard Holdings 3 years ago. A line of credit you defaulted on this morning when your assets were frozen by the court." Richard froze. He had forgotten about the Vanguard loan. It was a small bridge loan he used to buy his yacht. "Vanguard called the debt," the man continued, "and they exercised their right to seize the collateral. They then immediately sold that 20% block of stock to a private investor." "Who?" Richard whispered, though he already knew the answer. The dread pooling in his stomach was cold and heavy. The side door of the boardroom opened. Charlotte walked in. She had changed out of her courtroom thrift store suit. She was now wearing a tailored white power suit that radiated authority. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek bun. She didn't look like a waitress. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who owned the building. "Hello, Richard," she said softly. "You bought the stock." Richard said, his voice shaking. "I bought the debt," Charlotte corrected. "And then I took the stock, which combined with the shares my family trust has been quietly acquiring over the last 6 months, brings my total ownership of Sterling Dynamics to 65%. She walked over to the head of the table. The young man stood up and moved aside respectfully. Charlotte placed her hands on the back of the leather chair, Richard's chair. "I am the majority shareholder," Charlotte announced, looking around the room at the board members. "And my first motion as controlling owner is to call for a vote of no confidence in the current CEO, Richard Sterling, citing gross financial negligence, reputational damage, and corporate fraud." "Seconded," Jonathan Hayes said immediately, finally looking at Richard with disgust. "You lied to us about the North Tech merger, Richard. You told us it was a done deal. You didn't tell us you were trying to buy your wife's company." "I move for immediate termination," Charlotte said. "All in favor?" Jonathan asked. Every hand in the room went up. "Richard Sterling," Charlotte said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You are fired. Security will escort you out. You have 10 minutes to clear your desk. Take only personal items. Any company property, laptop, phone, car keys stays." "You can't do this," Richard screamed, lunging toward her. 2 large security guards stepped out from the shadows blocking his path. One of them grabbed Richard's arm. "Don't touch me," Richard yelled, thrashing. "I built this. This is mine." "It was never yours, Richard," Charlotte said, her eyes sad but firm. "You built it on my money, my support, and my patience, and you threw it all away because you thought you could do better." She looked past him to the doorway, where Jessica was standing, watching in horror. "And you," Charlotte said to the mistress. "Jessica, isn't it?" Jessica nodded, trembling. "You're the executive assistant, correct?" "Yes. Yes, Mrs. Sterling," Jessica stammered. "You're fired too," Charlotte said. "Inefficiency and gross misconduct. Clear your desk." Charlotte sat down in the CEO's chair, turning her attention to the board. Now, gentlemen, let's discuss how we're going to clean up this mess and rebrand. I'm thinking of changing the name. Sterling Dynamics has a bad reputation. As the security guards dragged a screaming Richard out of the room, the last thing he saw was his ex-wife, the woman he had discarded like trash, taking command of the only thing he ever loved. The sidewalk outside the Sterling building was cold, hard concrete. It was a stark contrast to the plush Persian rugs Richard was used to walking on. 2 security guards, men Richard had ignored for 5 years. Men whose names he had never bothered to learn, dropped a cardboard box at his feet. It landed with a pathetic thud. Inside were a stapler, a framed photo of himself shaking hands with a senator, and a half-empty bottle of cologne. "Mr. Sterling," the taller guard said, his voice devoid of sympathy, "you are banned from the premises. If you attempt to re-enter, we are authorized to use force and call the police." Richard straightened his tie, trying to salvage some shred of dignity. "You're making a mistake. I'll be back. I'll sue this entire company into the ground." "Good luck with that, sir," the guard said, turning his back and keying his radio. "Subject is off the property." Richard turned to the curb where his sleek black limousine was idling. Frank, his driver, was standing by the rear door. Richard sighed, relieved. At least he had the car. He could go to the country club, regroup, and call his contacts. "Frank, take us to the St. Regis," Richard commanded, reaching for the door handle. Frank stepped in front of the door, blocking him. "I can't do that, Mr. Sterling." Richard blinked. "Excuse me, Frank. I pay your salary. Open the door." "Actually, sir," Frank said, his face impassive, "the company pays my salary, and the new CEO, Ms. Kensington, just sent a memo. All company vehicles are for authorized personnel only. You're not on the list." "I bought this car," Richard screamed, his voice cracking. "Company leased it, sir," Frank corrected. He looked past Richard. "Ms. Jessica, the CEO has authorized a one-time courtesy ride for you to your apartment to collect your things, but only you." Richard spun around to look at Jessica. She was standing a few feet away, clutching her designer handbag, her eyes darting between Richard and the warm, dry car. "Jessica," Richard said, forcing a smile. "Don't listen to him. We'll get a taxi. We'll go to the penthouse. I'll fix this." Jessica looked at Richard. She looked at his messy hair, his red face, the cardboard box of junk at his feet. Then she looked at the limousine. "Richard," she said, her voice high and tight, "you're $18 million in debt. You don't have a penthouse. You don't have a job." "I have potential. I have connections," Richard pleaded, stepping toward her. "Baby, we're a team. You and me against the world. Remember." Jessica took a step back, a look of genuine disgust crossing her face. "I didn't sign up for against the world, Richard. I signed up for the yacht. I signed up for the Hamptons. If you're broke, you're just a 45-year-old man with a bad temper and a foreclosure notice." She sidestepped him and slid into the back of the limousine. "Jessica!" Richard yelled as she slammed the door. Frank got into the driver's seat. The window rolled down 1 inch. Jessica's eyes were visible. "Don't call me," she said. "I'm going to change my number." The window rolled up. The limousine pulled away, merging into traffic, leaving Richard standing alone on the curb with his box of office supplies. He stood there for a full minute, unable to process the speed of his collapse. 2 hours ago, he was a titan of industry. Now he was a pedestrian. "Fine," he muttered, kicking the cardboard box. "I don't need them. I have friends." He pulled out his personal cell phone. He dialed Brad Forrester, an investment banker he had played golf with every Sunday for 10 years. Brad owed him. Richard had given Brad insider tips that made him millions. Ring, ring, ring. "Hello?" Brad's voice answered. Brad. Thank God, Richard said, putting on his bravado voice. Listen, I'm in a bit of a bind. Hostile takeover. Crazy ex-wife drama. You know how it is. I need a place to crash for a few nights and maybe a bridge loan. Just a couple $100,000 to get my legal team moving. There was a long pause on the line. Richard, Brad said, his tone icy. I heard. Yeah, it's a mess, but I'll bounce back. I just need... You're not listening, Richard. Brad cut him off. I heard who your wife is. She's a Kensington. So what? So Kensington Global clears all my firm's international trades, Brad hissed. If I am seen buying you a cup of coffee, let alone lending you money, they could blacklist my firm. I'd be ruined. We're friends, Brad. We were golf partners, Richard. There's a difference. Don't call this number again. Click. Richard stared at the phone. He tried another number, then another. The result was the same. Panic rejection or simply a voicemail that would never be returned. The social elite of the city, the people who had laughed at his jokes and drunk his champagne, had formed a phalanx against him. They smelled blood in the water, and they knew the shark eating him was too big to fight. He checked his banking app. Access denied. Account frozen by court order. He checked his credit cards. Status cancelled. He checked his pocket. He had a $20 bill and a pack of gum. It started to rain again. Richard walked 6 blocks to a cheap motel on the outskirts of the business district. The neon sign buzzed ominously. The Starlight Inn. Hourly rates available. He slapped the $20 bill on the counter. The clerk, a man with a grease-stained shirt, didn't even look up from his TV. Room 104. Keys sticky. Don't steal the towels. Richard walked into the room. It smelled of stale smoke and mildew. He sat on the sagging mattress, still wearing his $3,000 suit. He put his head in his hands. Rage began to boil in his stomach. It wasn't fair. She had lied to him. She had trapped him. She thinks she's won, Richard whispered to the peeling wallpaper. She thinks she can just erase me. I know things. I know where she keeps her secrets. He remembered something. 7 years ago, when they first moved into the Sterling estate, Charlotte had insisted on keeping one room locked. Her private study, she called it. She said it was where she painted. Richard, uninterested in her hobbies, had never bothered to go in. He respected it only because he didn't care. But now he wondered. Why would a waitress need a private study? Why would a Kensington heir hide in a marriage to a mid-level CEO? There had to be skeletons in her closet. Something scandalous. Something that made her run away from her family in the first place. If he could find it, he could blackmail her. He could get his money back. Richard stood up, a dark plan forming in his mind. He still had the emergency key to the back garden gate on his keychain, the one the security guards had missed because it looked like a bottle opener. He wasn't going to court. He was going back to the house. It was 2:10 a.m. when Richard parked his rental car, a beat-up sedan he had paid for by pawning his Rolex watch at a 24-hour shop a mile down the road from the Sterling estate. He walked through the woods, the mud ruining his Italian leather shoes. The estate loomed in the distance, dark and silent. He knew the patrol schedules. He knew where the cameras were. He had installed them, after all. He reached the back garden gate. His hand trembled as he inserted the bottle opener key. It turned. Click. Still works. He grinned, slipping inside the grounds. He crept through the shadows of the manicured hedges. The house was dark. Charlotte was probably asleep in the master bedroom. His bedroom. The thought made his blood boil, but he pushed it down. He needed leverage, not a confrontation. Not yet. He bypassed the alarm system by cutting the external wire to the box near the garage, a flaw in the system he had meant to fix for years, but never got around to. He shimmied open the kitchen window. He dropped onto the tile floor, holding his breath. Silence. He moved through the house like a ghost. It felt different. The air smelled different, lighter, cleaner. His gaudy gold statues were gone. The heavy velvet drapes were pulled back. Even in the dark, he could feel that she had already erased his taste from the home. He reached the door to the private study on the second floor. It was locked, of course. Richard took a screwdriver he had swiped from the pawn shop and jammed it into the lock mechanism. He wasn't worried about being subtle anymore. He twisted hard. The wood splintered. The door popped open. Richard clicked on his small flashlight and stepped inside. He expected to find a safe, or stacks of cash, or maybe illicit love letters. Instead, he found a nursery. The room was painted a soft pastel yellow. There was a crib in the corner covered in a dust sheet. There was a rocking chair, and on the walls hundreds of photos. Richard stepped closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. The photos were of a baby boy. He saw photos of Charlotte holding the baby. She looked younger, happier, but also incredibly tired. He saw photos of an older man, the Duke of Kensington, holding the child. And then he saw the death certificate framed on the wall. Alexander Kensington Sterling. Born June 4th. Died June 6th. Richard froze. The dates. That was 8 years ago. 1 year before he met her. He looked at the desk in the center of the room. There was a leather journal lying open. He walked over and shone his light on the pages. The handwriting was Charlotte's. Entry, August 14th. I can't stay in the castle anymore. Everywhere I look, I see Alexander. Father tries to comfort me, but his grief is too loud. I need to go somewhere where I am nobody. Somewhere where I am not the Duchess who lost the heir. I need to be invisible. I'm going to America. I'm going to change my name. I just want to be normal. I want to find someone who loves me, for me, not for the tragedy I carry. Entry. November 2nd. I met a man named Richard today. He's ambitious, a bit loud, but he doesn't know who I am. He doesn't look at me with pity. He just sees a waitress. It's refreshing. Maybe I can build a new life with him. Maybe he can help me forget the pain. Richard dropped the journal. His hands were shaking violently. She hadn't been hiding a crime. She had been hiding her grief. She had married him because he was her escape from a tragedy. She had wanted a simple life. And he had treated her like an accessory. He had mocked her for being simple when that was the very thing she was desperately trying to be to survive her loss. Find what you were looking for, Richard. The voice came from the darkness behind him. Richard spun around, dropping the flashlight. The overhead lights flickered on, blinding him for a second. Charlotte stood in the doorway. She was wearing a silk robe, her arms crossed. She didn't look angry. She looked exhausted. Behind her stood Arthur Holloway and 2 large men who were definitely not regular security guards. They wore tactical vests. "You," Richard stammered, backing up against the crib. "You had a son." "I did," Charlotte said softly. "His heart wasn't strong enough. I ran away to mourn him. I met you, and I thought if I loved you enough, if I supported you enough, I could fill the hole in my heart." She took a step into the room, her eyes hard. "But you were a bottomless pit, Richard. You took everything I gave and demanded more. And when I couldn't give you the social status you craved, you threw me away." "I didn't know," Richard cried, pointing at the photos. "If you had told me you were a duchess, if you had told me about the baby, things would have been different." "Yes," Charlotte said, her voice dripping with disdain. "If you knew I was a duchess, you would have exploited my name to sell more stock, and if you knew about my son, you probably would have told me to get over it, because it was depressing your dinner guests." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. She was right. He knew deep down she was absolutely right. "I came here to find dirt on you," Richard admitted, his shoulders slumping. "I wanted to blackmail you." "I know," Charlotte said. "I saw you on the thermal cameras the moment you jumped the fence. I let you in, Richard." "Why?" "Because I wanted you to see this." She gestured to the room. "I wanted you to see that while you were chasing money and fame, you were living with a woman who had walked away from more wealth than you could ever imagine just to find something real. And you were too blind to see it." Arthur Holloway stepped forward, holding a pair of zip ties. "Breaking and entering it," Arthur listed off. "Burglary. Violation of a restraining order. Industrial espionage. And damage to private property." He pointed to the broken lock. "Wait." Richard panicked. "Charlotte, please, don't call the police. I'm your husband. Well, ex-husband. We shared a life." "You shared a life with a reflection of yourself, Richard," Charlotte said, turning to walk away. "You never knew me, and now you never will." She nodded to the guards. "Take him. The police are waiting at the main gate." "Charlotte!" Richard screamed as the guards grabbed him, forcing his arms behind his back. "Charlotte, I'm sorry. I can change. I can be better." She stopped at the top of the stairs and looked back. "It's too late for change, Richard," she said. "The prenup you loved so much, it cuts both ways. You leave with what you brought, and you brought nothing but greed." She walked down the hall, leaving him to be dragged out of the nursery, past the photos of the life he was too shallow to understand, and into the waiting handcuffs of the law. 6 months later, the courtroom was packed again. But this time, Richard Sterling didn't walk in through the front doors, flanked by high-priced lawyers and a younger mistress. This time, he was led in through the side door, wearing an orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to his waist. The fall had been absolute. The media had dubbed it the Sterling crash. Not only had he lost his company and his home, but the investigation launched by the new board of directors under Charlotte's guidance had uncovered years of embezzlement, tax fraud, and insider trading. Richard hadn't just been a bad husband. He had been a criminal using the company accounts as his personal piggy bank to fund a lifestyle he couldn't actually afford. He looked 10 years older. His hair was thinning, his face gaunt. When he sat down at the defendant's table, his public defender, an overworked young man who clearly didn't want to be there, barely acknowledged him. On the other side of the aisle sat Charlotte. She wore a simple navy dress. She looked serene, untouchable. Beside her, Arthur Holloway sat like a stone gargoyle guarding his queen. Judge Harrison, looking significantly more respectful than he had during the divorce hearing, shuffled his papers. "Mr. Sterling from Wasur." The judge began, his voice echoing in the silent room. "You are here for sentencing regarding the charges of grand larceny, corporate fraud, and breaking and entering. You have pleaded guilty to all counts." "I had no choice," Richard muttered, his voice raspy. "They cornered me." You cornered yourself, the judge snapped. You have destroyed a legacy, defrauded investors of millions, and attempted to intimidate a witness. The judge turned his attention to Charlotte. Excuse me, Ms. Kensington. Before I pass sentence, do you have a victim impact statement? The courtroom held its breath. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the moment the waitress finally spoke to the tycoon. Charlotte stood up. She didn't walk to the podium. She stood right where she was, her gaze fixed on the man she had wasted 7 years on. I don't have a long statement, Your Honor. Charlotte said, her voice clear and melodic. For 7 years, this man told me who I was. He told me I was lucky. He told me I was small. He told me I was nothing without him. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Richard couldn't even meet her eyes. He stared at the table, a tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. But the truth is, Charlotte continued, he was the one who was small. He was so terrified of being ordinary that he couldn't recognize something extraordinary, even when it was sleeping in the bed next to him. He wanted a trophy, Your Honor. He didn't want a partner. And when you treat people like objects, you shouldn't be surprised when they turn out to be heavier than you can lift. She looked at the judge. I don't ask for vengeance. Vengeance is for people who are still hurt. I am not hurt anymore. I am just finished. I ask for the maximum sentence not because I hate him, but because society needs to be protected from men who think the world owes them everything. She sat down. The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of finality. Richard Sterling, Judge Harrison said, banging his gavel once. For the crimes committed, I sentence you to 15 years in a federal correctional facility with no possibility of parole for the first 10. Furthermore, you are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $18 million. Since you have no assets, your future wages, should you ever earn any, will be garnished by 80% until the debt is paid. Richard slumped forward, putting his head on the table. A sob escaped his throat. 15 years. He would be 60 years old when he got out. He would be an old man with nothing. Court is adjourned, the judge announced. The bailiff moved in, grabbing Richard by the arm. Let's go, Sterling. As they dragged him up, Richard looked back one last time. Charlotte, he cried out, desperation in his eyes. Charlotte, please, just tell me one thing. Did you ever love me? Was any of it real? Charlotte stopped packing her bag. She turned slowly. She looked at the pathetic figure in orange, the man who had thrown her out into the rain, without a second thought. I loved the man I thought you were, Richard, she said softly. But that man never existed. He was just a costume you wore to trick the world, and I don't love costumes. She turned her back on him and walked toward the heavy oak doors. Arthur opened them for her. Outside, the sun was shining. It was a bright, blinding white light. The paparazzi were there, but they kept a respectful distance. They didn't shout questions at her anymore. They knew who she was now. She wasn't the discarded wife. She was Charlotte Kensington, the Duchess of Wall Street. She walked down the steps, took a deep breath of the fresh air, and smiled. For the first time in 7 years, she was free. Richard Sterling served 12 years of his 15-year sentence. When he was released, the world had moved on. Sterling Dynamics no longer existed. It had been absorbed into the Kensington Empire and rebranded as Kensington North, a leading charitable tech firm that provided affordable housing solutions. Richard ended up working as a dishwasher in a small diner in New Jersey, ironically very similar to the one where he had met Charlotte. He lives in a small studio apartment, and every month, 80% of his minimum wage paycheck disappears to pay off a debt he will never clear. He spends his breaks reading newspapers, telling the younger staff that he used to be a CEO, that he used to be married to a duchess. They just laugh and tell him to get back to scrubbing the pots. Charlotte never remarried. She devoted her life to the Alexander Kensington Foundation, named after her late son. The foundation became the largest supporter of pediatric heart research in the world, saving thousands of children every year. She lives quietly on her family estate, surrounded by friends who know her real name, and more importantly, her real heart. She proved that dignity isn't about the title you hold or the money in your bank account. It's about how you treat people when you think you have the power to destroy them. And in the end, her name didn't just freeze a courtroom. It froze a legacy of greed, shattering it forever. Wow. Talk about instant karma. Richard thought he was throwing out the trash, but he ended up throwing away his entire life. It just goes to show you never really know who someone is until you see how they treat people they think they don't need. What do you think? Did Richard deserve that 15-year sentence, or was losing his fortune enough punishment? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story about the dark side of the rich and powerful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.